guys, Chris from Average Eskate Reviews here, and today in this video we're going to be taking a look at the Meepo Hurricane, which is a carbon-based board, and VSing it against the Evolve Hadean carbon, which of course, as the name suggests, is also carbon. So both of these boards are pretty similar in spec and performance, fairly big difference in price. So if you're trying to figure out which one of these two boards you should have, that's exactly what we're going to be trying to answer in this video. And also, before we jump into the video, please make sure you've thumbs up and you've also subscribed so you can stay up to date with all of the videos that we post. And before we jump in, comment down below and let us know what other boards you want us to VS against each other next. Now, of course, you know I like to split all of these videos into categories. Now, normally or traditionally, I would always start with the speed of the board, but we'll do that second. I think the most important thing that we have to highlight in this video is going to be the price, because these two boards do have a massive difference in price. The Meepo is traditionally priced at $1,799, but is currently priced on Meepo's website as $1,599, whereas the Evolve Hadean Carbon is priced at $2,499. There's a big difference in price, and hopefully what we want to do in this video is trying to explain what our experiences with both these two boards have been like, and hopefully clear up a couple of misconceptions or give you guys some information that you might need before you make a purchase on either one of these two boards. Now, when you look at the price, it's very easy to say, how can one carbon board that essentially has a better top speed and a better range, which we'll come to in a little bit more detail later on in the video, be priced as less than a board that isn't performing as well or as highly as you could say? But there's a lot of things that come into the price that's not really broken down in a lot of the videos that we see on YouTube, or when you're looking on a website and looking at specs from two different boards with different pricing and trying to figure out which is going to be the best buy. Now, when you break down the costs that are involved and associated with creating a skateboard, me and Ricky can definitely vouch for the fact that we know what that's like. But with these two boards, I think what gets missed is the way that these two companies operate, the servicing that they offer, and also the finish and the components that are used on each of these boards. When you look at them very closely, you do see some discrepancies in the constructions of these boards, and that has a massive influence on the price that these boards are going to be priced at. When we look at the Hadean from Evolve, now, although this board is significantly more expensive, when you look at the refinements of how, for example, the cables that attach the motor to the motor controller and the battery are set up on this board, the finish of the carbon fiber that's on this board, the fact that it's a chassis design and is significantly thinner, lower profile, better balanced, all of these different things and different construction methods are going to affect the price point. In addition to this, which is probably more important, it's going to be the servicing. And this seems like a really harsh way to start the video off, but I think this is going to be kind of like the Achilles heel of which one of these two boards you go for. A lot of people that have bought the Hurricane boards, and this isn't a shot at Meepo because I know their customer service has improved tenfold from the way it was a few years ago, but because they are a smaller company than Evolve, they don't have service points or service stations in multiple countries, in multiple cities sometimes, to enable their customers to get their boards serviced fairly hassle-free. The way that it works is if something goes wrong with your Meepo Hurricane, for example, a motor controller, which is an issue that somebody that we know that owns this board is dealing with right now, you would have to triage and go back and forth with Meepo via email, which can take quite a long time. Once the issue is identified, Meepo then essentially will organize shipping you that component for you to change it yourself. Now, there are stores that sell these products and can offer some level of servicing, but it's a case of figuring out how in detail they're going to be able to assist you if something goes wrong with the board, and you need to be prepared to be willing to make repairs to your own board. Now, for me, that's something that just doesn't work. If something goes wrong with my board, I'm very hands-off. I want to post it somewhere. I want it to be fixed, get updates, and it to be posted back to me. I don't want to have to wait for components to come in from overseas. God knows how long that's going to take. And then when they finally arrive, if that's not what the issue that stopped the board from working actually was, and the issue was diagnosed badly, all of a sudden you have to repeat the entire process. You have a board that's not working and you start again. It doesn't seem like it's a big deal when you're buying a board and you're seeing the difference in price and spec. But when something goes wrong with it, as inevitably it will happen at some point, you need to be prepared to deal with not having a service station in the country that you are based in. And I feel like that's probably one of the massive reasons one of these boards in terms of the Meepo is priced significantly lower than the Evolve Hadean. This isn't favoritism with Evolve, this is just facts. If my Evolve Hadean goes wrong, I can drive to London to where the Evolve store is, drop my board off. I can speak to the people there to find out what's wrong with it, get an ETA of how long it's going to take, go back and pick it up. I don't have to worry about dealing with people in other countries, which is a massive, massive deal breaker when you're buying something that you have to heavily rely on to get you from point A to point B and also to have some fun. Last thing you want is your board going wrong at the start of summer and not being able to ride until you get your components shipped in. Now from there, the next category we're going to be looking at is going to be speed. This is the fun one. Now, I can't even argue this point. There isn't a close link between these two boards in terms of top speed. The Meepo board advertises a top speed of 35 miles an hour, but I don't know what wheel setup or gear setup that is. But the way that we had the Meepo Hurricane that we were using was on a 55 tooth gear setup with a 6-inch wheel. Now that would hit 31 miles an hour easily, no problem. Both me and Ricky were messing around on this board and it is quick. Off the line, it's not as quick as the Hadean Carbon, but what happens is once the boards start rolling and you get to sort of 10-15 miles an hour, the Meepo just shoots past the Evolve Hadean because it has a much higher top speed. And also the acceleration curve with this board, although it's very gradual at the start, once it starts moving and you're at the sort of 10-15 mile an hour mark, you hit that second acceleration curve or little boost, and then off the board goes. And that's when you're like, holy crap, I'm going fast. So if you're trying to figure out which one of these two boards is quicker, the Hadean Carbon is going to top out at about 27 or 28 miles an hour, whereas the Hurricane from Meepo is going to go on to 31 miles an hour. And as you guys know, when you look at boards like this that are all-terrain boards using those pneumatic tires, 31 miles an hour is literally the ideal speed that I'd like to be able to hit. And also what's really important for me to mention is the Hurricane standardly comes with a 6-inch wheel, but we did switch it out to some aftermarket wheels, not from Meepo, that was 7-inch, and we also put this board on a 60-tooth gear to make sure that it was using the exact same setup as the Carbon from Evolve. We wanted to put these boards on the same wheel setup, the same gear setup, so we could test the different performance features of both these boards to make it as fair as possible. Because if we did it with 6-inch and 7-inch with different gear setups, it wouldn't be very accurate. But even on a 7-inch wheel with a 60-tooth gear, the Hurricane was able to hit 31 miles an hour, no problem at all. Now from there, the next category we're going to be looking at is acceleration. We did an acceleration test with both of these boards. Normally we would do me and Ricky on the boards and kind of like switch over, but it made more sense to try and make the test as fair as possible to just have Ricky doing it. We essentially set up a distance that the boards would be riding. It was the same distance every single time. And the idea was to see which one of these boards would be the quickest getting from naught or a standstill all the way up to 20 miles an hour. The acceleration was measured on the ground, and we also had an aerial shot with the drone, so you could see exactly how these boards pulled off the line and which one of them was the better performing board. Now here's a quick clip of those acceleration tests so you can see exactly how the Meepo Hurricane and also the Evolve Hadean Carbon performed during these tests. So from there, we're going to be looking at the ride of these boards. This is going to be one of the most important factors that needs to be considered when you're picking up one of these skateboards. And again, this is something that you can't predict or understand when you're looking at a website and all you're considering is the spec list, what the manufacturers are claiming, and what the price is. The ride is equally going to be one of the most important things that you need to be able to get an understanding of. Now, with the Meepo Hurricane, we've mentioned this in previous videos, but the first thing you want to do with this board is get rid of those bushings because they are ridiculously crap. That's probably the biggest letdown with this board next to the remote, but I'll touch on that later on. The bushings, regardless of how tight you make them, will always eventually still get soft and loose. They're just a really crappy compound that isn't going to be great for riders pretty much over 65, 75 kilograms. It just doesn't work. Now, the way that affected the ride is when you're cruising at lower speeds, anything sort of below 20 to 25 miles an hour, the board feels fine. But if you go up past 25 miles an hour, it feels incredibly unstable. You feel like your trucks aren't anywhere near as tight or as dialed in as you'd want them to be, which makes going top speed essentially incredibly dangerous. So it's something that I definitely suggest everyone does with these boards, is rip out the bushings and put some quality ones in. But aside from that, during these tests, we did, as I said earlier on in the video, switch the wheels from 6-inch to 7-inch, and that made a very, very big difference in how the board's stability felt, even with Meepo's ridiculously bad bushings. It made the board feel a lot more stable. I'm not gonna say I felt safe, I just felt a lot more stable on it using 7-inch wheels than I did with the 6-inch wheels that standardly come with the Meepo when you pick the all-terrain setup. Now, when we VS that against the Evolve Hadean Carbon, now this board has, even with the bushings that come standard from Evolve, they are significantly better than what you see in the Meepo. The trucks do sit at a slightly different pitch than what we see on the Meepo Hurricane, even though they're both double kingpin trucks, so that's definitely worth mentioning. But what you get with the Evolve Hadean, and again, this isn't taking sides, it's not trying to have any sort of favoritism towards Evolve, it is a much smoother, much more predictable, much more consistent ride. You're able to carve harder, carve deeper, even some of the shots that are overlay. Carving on both of these two boards felt good, but when you jump onto the Meepo Hurricane and then immediately jump onto the Evolve Carbon, in this case the Hadean, I just felt that I could go much deeper into my carves. I felt like I had much more control over the board. It was much more predictable the way it was going to react, and this had a massive impact on my confidence while riding the board, which any rider can tell you is key. A board that makes you feel confident is always going to be the board that you should pick over another. Now, in addition to this, some of the other things that I noticed during the ride, like while I was carving, and it's things that I mentioned in the previous video where we looked at a standalone review of the Meepo, and that was just the way that the remote would respond to you releasing the trigger during carving or during accelerating. The sensation that the remote gives you when you're going quite quick or you're carving and you let go off of the throttle, you get like a jerking motion as you can feel power being kind of like dialed back from the motors. Every board does this, but the jerkiness and the strength or the sensitivity of how much you feel that is very different from manufacturer to manufacturer. When you're carving and you release the trigger on the Evolve Hadean, it's not like a jerky motion. The board kind of rolls and you don't really feel like a loss in power or that kind of jerk that almost feels like you're tapping the brake. But with the Meepo, this was something that I noticed, and it made it very difficult to carve consistently, because normally when I'm carving, I like to feather the throttle, as I said in the previous video, and that just felt a lot more difficult to kind of predict in the Meepo Hurricane. Now, of course, maybe riding the board a little bit longer, spending more time with it, I would adjust to this, but I feel I've ridden a lot of boards to notice that this isn't something that I've felt in some of the other boards that maybe have a slightly higher price point. Not necessarily Evolves, but just other boards in general, so it's definitely something worth noting. Now, from there, looking at other aspects of the ride, the deck stiffness is something that definitely needs to be mentioned. Although both of these boards are carbon fiber, the Meepo Hurricane felt significantly stiffer than the Evolve. I'm not sure if this is something in our heads. Like, Ricky, do you think it is in our heads, or do you get where I'm coming from?
The deck on the Hurricane is ridiculously...
There's no play.
There's no give at all in anything.
Yeah,
it's
like
solid. It
is a solid deck. And obviously if you're a bigger rider or you like that really kind of like stiff, rigid skateboard deck, then that could be a benefit for you. But of course, you guys know I like a flexible deck. Neither of these boards have a flexible deck, and in all honesty, I don't like either of the decks because they're carbon. I prefer bamboo, but the Meepo one was much stiffer than the Evolve deck, so it's definitely worth mentioning. But for heavier riders, bigger riders, maybe that'll be a good thing. It does mean that, especially with the standard wheel setup, which is 6-inch, you feel so much of the bumps, the vibrations when you're riding over different surfaces, which goes without saying. Even on 7-inch, you do still feel them, but I just thought I'd mention that. This deck is incredibly stiff, zero play. Now from there, when we look at the different shapes of these decks, the Evolve has a drop down with a very, very mild W concave on the actual body of the deck where you have your feet. Now this is incredibly mild. It actually feels more flat than anything else. Whereas the Meepo, it also has a drop down in terms of the carbon deck on the top and also the bottom, or the back and the front, but it's a much deeper, more aggressive drop down. And also the W concave on the Meepo board is also much more pronounced or exaggerated than what you'd see on the Evolve. We'll overlay some shots so you can see side by side what I'm talking about, but this comes down to personal preference. I found riding the Meepo for a longer period of time, I kind of got cramps in my feet. It didn't feel as comfortable as a kind of like flatter deck. Now this is of course personal preference, because I know some people like that really aggressive concave and that aggressive drop down, but others don't. So make sure that you note that one of these boards in terms of the Meepo is much more exaggerated on the drop downs and also the depth of the concaves. And as a quick side note, because of how aggressive the drop down is, you actually do lose a bit of foot placement on the deck itself. In terms of how much foot placement you're losing, it's about ½ an inch. The Evolve Hadean has about 27 inches of usable foot space, whereas the Meepo Hurricane has 26.5 inches of usable foot space. And also, just for reference, these two decks are also roughly the same width as well, which is roughly about 10 inches. So just in case you needed to know that. Now, when we move on to the category of range, both of these boards are using 12S4P batteries. They're using the exact same battery cells, so you can expect to get a similar range, give or take a couple of miles, depending on where you ride and how you ride, which is roughly about the, I'm going to say 18 to 22 mile mark in terms of the range that you get from these boards. But of course, your build, what kind of a bag you're carrying, how heavy it is, the surface you're riding on, the weather conditions, whether it's warm or cold, all of these different things will affect your range, the gradient of road that you're riding on, how many inclines and declines you go down. So range is always going to be incredibly subjective, so bear that in mind. But both using the same battery cells, so you can expect to get a very similar amount of range out of both of these boards. Now from there, we'll touch a little bit on the design of both of these two boards. Although they are carbon fiber boards, or carbon fiber decks rather, you can see that from the design of the boards, clear as night and day, that one of them does look more expensive than another. That's not being unfair. I think anyone looking at these two boards, if you laid them out on the ground, turned them upside down, people would probably say the Hadean Carbon looks more expensive than the Meepo Hurricane. Now, of course, that is represented in the price points in terms of the finishings and how kind of crazy these two companies can go with the designs of what they create, whether they're functional based changes or they're just changes for purely aesthetical benefits. But with the layering that you see on the carbon fiber board from Evolve, which is the Hadean, it has kind of like a random weave construction as opposed to what you see in the Meepo and what we also saw previously on the GTR Carbon, which is kind of like that more layered, gridded network of carbon fiber meshing that you would see. What they've done with the Hadean Carbon is actually because of the chassis design. It means that the orientation of the way that the carbon fiber strands offer strength and durability to the deck, it being random, fits the chassis design, because essentially the cutout in the middle of the board that would traditionally have carbon fiber is now completely gone. If you remove the top case from the Hadean board and also the battery and remove that out, you essentially have a hole in the middle of the board. So the new carbon fiber patterning is to offer strength and more durability because of this new deck design. Now, what we see when we look at Meepo's design is a more traditional carbon fiber patterning that you would see. This is essentially what we saw previously with the GTR construction. It has that unibody, I'm going to refer to it as carbon fiber shell, where it has a pocket in the top where all of the battery and electronics and etc. and all the cabling sits inside, then a top cover goes on the top of it. Whereas the Evolve has that cutout, the battery slots into the middle of the deck, which is responsible for not only making the board look better and look more futuristic, but it makes the board significantly thinner as well. The Meepo Hurricane is roughly 2¼ inches thick, whereas the Evolve Hadean Carbon is roughly 1¼ inch thick. That doesn't sound like it's a big difference, but it makes a massive difference when you look at the clearance on the bottom of these boards. So if you're going to be riding off-road a lot, that's going to have a big impact on how much clearance you have on the bottom of the deck. And also doing things like dropping down off of curbs. I know a lot of people probably don't like to do that, but all of this is going to be affected by how much clearance you have on the bottom of the board. When we look at the Meepo Hurricane, you're getting 3.5 inches of clearance underneath the board. So if you're riding over pump tracks or anything like that, you need to bear that in mind. When we look at the Hadean Carbon, you're getting 5 inches of clearance underneath the deck of that board. So if clearance underneath the body of the board is something that you need to consider, there's a big difference between these two boards. The next category is going to be the design and the ports on both of these boards. Now, both boards have essentially the same ports on them. It's your power button and also the charge port, and they're both located in pretty much the exact same spot on the board. But one thing I did mention with the Evolve versus the Meepo is the Evolve's charger port, after you remove the weather seal cover, is tucked right deep inside the body of the board, which means you have just a crapper time trying to plug it in. It's not something you can do quickly. It's not something you can do in the dark. You need to kind of get it just right and in the right place. Whereas the Meepo's port kind of sits a little bit more out on the surface. So it means that it's so much easier to plug the board into charge. Doesn't sound like it's a big deal. It's one of these little finicky, nitpicky things that you can have, but it was a big difference. And in addition to this, although one board has lights, which is the Evolve Hadean Carbon, you turn the board on, it's got lights, the logo on top of the board lights up, it's got lights on the bottom of the board on the edging, which looks very, very nice. And it also gives you an indication if the board is on or off, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's nice to be able to have that. The Meepo Hurricane doesn't have any lights like that. Of course, this is something that you could probably figure out a way of wiring in. We have seen people do this on like a kind of like a budget level. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's something that you can do. This board doesn't have lights, but one thing it does have is when you turn the power button on the board bleeps. So it lets you know that it's on. And if you leave the board on, the remote will go to sleep, but the board will stay in kind of like a sleep mode. And if you kick the board and kind of like push and roll for a few feet, it'll automatically turn the board back on, which is a really nice feature that the Evolve board does not have. As a side note, while I'm talking about that, and I remember it, neither of these boards have reverse, which sucks, because after coming from a DIY board, I really want my board to have a reverse gear. I thought I'd just throw that in there as well. And FYI, the auto start will turn on even if the board isn't already on. So that is a really nice feature to have on a board at that price point. Now, in terms of weather sealing and water resistance, now Evolve don't give their board a rating that we know of. If we are wrong, please comment down below and let us know. But when we look at the Meepo Hurricane, this is where things get interesting. Their board is claiming that it is IP67 rated, which effectively means that the entire board can be submerged under up to a meter of water for 30 minutes without incurring any issues whatsoever. This is on Meepo's website. So technically, we could grab our Hurricane and chuck it into a river or a swimming pool in 1 meter of water, leave it there for 30 minutes, it'll come out and it should be working just fine. This is something that we want to do, but of course we might need you guys to help us with this one. If we get enough requests for it, we will submerge a Meepo Hurricane in a meter of water for up to 30 minutes and see what happens. But if that's correct, this would essentially make this, in terms of the mainstream board manufacturers that are out there, the most weather sealed and water resistant board that is out there on the current market, which I think is insane. So if you want to see that, and this is actually true, then making the decision between a board that you can ride in the wet, because I know that's a big thing for some people, you live in countries that rain a lot like ours, that could be a massive deal breaker for one board over another. One board being don't ride it in the wet, and another one saying that you can submerge it underwater and it's just fine. We'll test that theory out if you guys really want to see that done, but if that is the case and that is true, and if anything happens, Meepo will warranty service the board because obviously it's a claim that they've put on their website, then that could be a massive deal breaker for you deciding which one of these two boards is going to be the best one for you. So comment down below and let me know if you want us to make that happen. Now on to the second to last point, which is the charge times of both of these boards. The Evolve Hadean has a 5 amp charger, whereas the Meepo Hurricane has a 6.5 amp charger. That doesn't sound like it's a big deal if you're not too into like the tech or the way that batteries work, but as I found out, it's a massive deal. When the Evolve board is essentially as low as I'd like to get it, it takes roughly 4 and a bit hours to charge the board all the way back up to 100%. Whereas the Meepo, when it's pretty much as low as I'd want to take that board, it only took roughly about 2 hours or less to get the board back up to 100%. That makes a massive difference when you're out riding. It's not nice to have to stop riding your board and wait 4 hours plus for it to charge up. I remember running the Meepo board down to 1 bar of battery, and it only took about an hour and a half for the board to be back up on 100%. So in terms of being able to ride and go the entire day having fun on the board, that more powerful charger has a massive advantage over the less powerful charger that Evolve offer with their Hadean Carbon. But saying that, we have heard word of a fast charger coming to the Hadean Carbon very, very soon. So that's something to look forward to. But at the moment in time that this video was filmed, the Meepo board charges significantly faster than the Hadean from Evolve. And also a point that we're going to touch on quickly is the braking of both of these boards. The Evolve had slightly softer braking than what we see with the Meepo board. Of course, this can be tweaked in settings, but overall we found that the Evolve had a little bit softer braking than what we would see with Meepo. For the price point of the board, I do have to admit that the braking on that board was pretty good. Now the last point is going to be the remotes on both of these boards. Now when we look at what we see with the Meepo board, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, this is one of the biggest letdowns with the board at this price point, but when it's at this price point you cannot expect everything to be premium, it's just how things go. The remote on the Meepo Hurricane just feels like the standard cheap scroll wheel hobby wing remote that we would see in a board 4 years ago even. It has a very basic digital display that shows you the remote's battery life in bars and the board's battery life in bars, which I always find is just nowhere near as accurate as seeing a percentage. But that's obviously personal preference. But in the experience of riding these two boards, the accuracy of what the remote shows you versus what the other remote shows you is a big difference. I feel like if the Evolve shows me that I've got 10%, I've got 10% left. But if the Meepo Hurricane shows me 1 bar, then that bar's gone, how much do I have left? It's very difficult to know exactly how much range you have left with the board when the remote is so basic. But aside from this, the Meepo Hurricane's remote does show you the basic information that you'd want to see, like your riding range, what the total riding range of the board is. But I just feel like in this day and age, having a board of anything that costs more than 1,500 in my opinion, and still having a pretty basic remote, I feel like that's something that needs to be changed. When we look at the Evolve remote on the Hadean Carbon, that remote has a very, very nice new digital screen. It's incredibly well manufactured. It has elements of metal as well as plastics and rubbers, so it just feels chunky and solid and expensive. And also the information that the remote shows you in terms of creating different rides, ride 1, ride 2, so you can see how far you rode on ride 1, how far you rode on ride 2, as well as obviously also tracking the total range that the board has done. In addition to this, you can go into the board, you can change the braking sensitivity, you can also do this in the app, you can change the acceleration curves. Aside from this, you can also change the setups that you have on the board in terms of the lights. Do you want them off? Do you want them on? The remote just has a lot more functionality to it and feels much more premium, much more quality than what we see with the Meepo Hurricane. But of course, bear in mind the price difference between these two boards. But I felt like that was one of the letdowns with the Meepo Hurricane. It was going so well until I touched that remote, and it just felt like what we saw with Meepo's first generation of boards. So hopefully this video's managed to break down the main things that you need to consider when you're picking up a board. Now, of course, there's a big difference between these two boards' price, but hopefully by going through all of these categories, we've given you the information to figure out which one that you would go for. Weigh up the pros and cons of both and figure out which of the categories that were issues and that were positives are going to apply to yourself, your needs, based on what you want your board to be able to do, what you need the board to be able to do, how much you want to spend, and where you live in the world, because all of that's going to affect maybe which one of these boards you need to consider picking up. But if there's any other videos you want to see us shoot, any other boards you want us to VS against each other, please comment down below and let us know what those are. Big thank you for watching all the way to the end. Make sure you thumbs up and subscribe so you can stay up to date with all of the videos that we post, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.